Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson. We're continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We're in Matthew chapter 22. We're going to be reading verses 15 through 22. And this is the first of the three questions that we're going to have, where people ask Jesus questions. Before we leave the parable yesterday, there's that tagline, many are called but few are chosen, that is a quotable, that many people quote when they don't even know they're quoting Jesus. Jesus has said in Matthew chapter 7, in the very first sermon, in the Sermon on the Mount, that there's a way that leads to eternal life, and few are going to find it. Most people are going to choose themselves the way of destruction. So there is the choosing that we do, and then the choosing that God does. God sees our response, the choices that we have made, and then he makes his choice. And Jesus has already told several parables how we're going to leave the tares in the ground, we're going to cast the net and bring in a lot of fish, but then there's going to be a sorting of sorts, and looking forward to the judgment. And I don't want to leave that verse before we mention that. So, you know how in those kung fu movies, when the champion is fighting a bunch of guys, he gets to fight them one at a time, and maybe each one has their specialty, and he defeats each one in turn. Well, we have something like that going on here, because this coalition that has come together to oppose Jesus, they're each going to take their turn and take their best shot at Jesus today. And he's going to easily deflect and defeat their attempts to discredit them before the crowd. This coalition, which involves the Pharisees and the high priests group, the Sadduceic party, I mean, they don't like each other, and they don't agree at all on key points of responding to God. There are members of the Pharisees who are in the Sanhedrin, the ruling council. They all have to deal with the Romans. The Romans are imposing peace upon them at this time, but they're just, I mean, the Jews are a people completely divided at this point between how you deal with westernization and the power of the Roman Empire. And so you have a group that says we can still be Jews and live within the Roman Empire, and they did, and yet they did go a long way to ameliorating their themselves culturally to the Romans, and quite enjoyed, going to the theater and going to the gymnasia and getting their classical educations in addition to their Hebrew educations. And then there was the people who felt oppressed, and the people who wanted their nation back and wanted the Romans gone, and they were quite conservative in their Judaism, and yet they all agreed that Jesus had to go. Well, at least their leaders did, the leaders of these two movements. It would be like the leaders of QAnon and the leaders of Antifa came together, to oppose one person, and so they each are going to take their shot. And as they do, they're taking their shot at each other as well. And I think we can't miss that when we read this. So the first opponent up are the Pharisees, and they have the longest history with Jesus. I mean, they have been following him. He's been in the villages. They're in the villages. They've been ambivalent about him, and then they've rejected him altogether, and they've been dogging him, or trying to, his entire ministry. And so the hot button issue with people was the paying of taxes, because the Roman government, imposed taxes and then farmed it out to contractors who took their own coin. Jesus has just cleansed the temple of the money changers. The people see him as their champion economically, and so this is pretty good, left jab they throw right into Jesus's face, or at least they think they are. The Pharisees counseled together how they might trap him in what they said and what he said. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a tax to Caesar or not? Jesus perceived their malice and said, Why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. I always say that if I had a choice between holding this and having it to read and seeing Jesus walk on water or still the storm, I'd rather have this, because this is the greater miracle. And to see how words can take us to the very moment and time travel us, and to listen to Jesus so simply just completely answer this complex question for them and deflect everything that they've tried to do. I mean, it's just a great miracle. It's a superpower that he has, if I want to get vulgar about it and use a cultural term. Jesus uses words. He uses words in a way that gives him power, the power of the truth, because they are true words. They're talking about the specific tax they pay to the Roman government, not the tax that they're paying, to the temple or any of those. They're talking about the tax that goes directly to the Roman government that's supposed to pay for the Roman occupation and the Roman building projects and things like that. And they had to pay that in Roman money. They had to pay that in a Roman denarius. And so they've got those in their pockets. And he knows that. And so he says, show me the coin. Now that's a point of contention with them, because the Pharisees believed that the image on the coin itself, like George Washington's image on a quarter, is an act of idolatry, because people worshiped Caesar as if he was a god. And therefore, for them to have to use a coin with an idol on it was to them it was anathema. I mean, literally anathema. It was awful for them. In fact, when Jesus was about 12 years old, there were these anti-Roman riots over the coinage. Jews wanted to be able to pay their taxes in coinage that didn't have Caesar's imprint on it. And Jesus may have even seen these as a boy, because these were going on at the Passover time in the year when Jesus was probably 12, 13 years old. That might have happened around the time that we read Luke chapter 2, when Jesus has stayed behind in the temple. I mean, that might be a background, detail that lets us understand just how frightened Mary is at her kids back in the city when all this unrest has been going on. And so, I mean, he doesn't avoid the hot button issue. He dives right into it, and he says, show me the coin. And in talking about the coin, this is the Pharisees kind of taking a jab at the Herodians too, because the Herodians are collaborators with the Romans. And he says, whose picture is this? Well, Caesar's. Well, then give it back to him. Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And we can read Romans 12 and 13 and Paul's huge meditation on church and state, and we will not learn anything that we don't learn already in what Jesus just said about our responsibility to be law-abiding, tax-paying citizens, and yet we give to God the things that are uniquely his. It's amazing what he says in one line. Well, the Herodians they're going to take their shot next time. Thank you for joining me for another 5 Good Minutes with the Word.